One of the biggest questions we have is how could a good God allow evil? But everybody does something wrong. Is the existence of evil just God's bad? Let's consider. Hello philosophers, I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Now, we've been considering the problem of evil, which looks something like this. If God exists, he could prevent evil because he's all-knowing and all-powerful. If God exists, he would prevent evil because he's all good. So therefore, if God exists, evil doesn't exist. But evil does exist, therefore God doesn't exist. This begins a stretch where we consider solutions to the problem of evil that reject premise 2. Now, the supporting argument for premise 2 is false if either God is not all good or if God could have good reasons for allowing evil. In this video, let's consider the following question. Why must God be 100% good? Now, I should say before I get started that I don't believe that this is true. I find it deplorable, but we're just considering this, for the sake of argument. And sometimes, when you see why something is wrong, it helps you to figure out what's right. So let's go ahead and check it out. Now, before we even get started, it seems like you could pose an objection, but wait, this sounds like something that an atheist would say, something that a person that doesn't believe in God would say to a theist. The problem of evil is posed by atheists to prove that God doesn't exist. If we're considering responses to the problem of evil, well, how could a theist, a person that believes in God, consider that God would be evil? It's interesting that polytheists, people that believe that there's more than one God, really have historically had no problems with believing that the gods could do evil things, cheat, lie, rape, do all kinds of crazy stuff. But once you get to the idea that there's one God, monotheism, it becomes very important that God not be in any way evil. And there are a good deal of theological and philosophical reasons for thinking so. We'll explore some of those in this video. So the concern is that this sounds like something that an atheist might say and not a theist. But I think a little bit of further thought will prove that that can't be so. Now, what I'm about to say is going to sound painfully obvious once I say it, but for some reason I've heard very intelligent people make this very mistake. So just stick with me on this one. Just think about saying God is evil. That very statement itself assumes that God exists. So it's obviously not something that an atheist could say. An atheist, for example, couldn't be angry with God because an atheist doesn't believe that God exists in the first place. It would be like being angry with Pandora for opening that box. There is no Pandora, so who are you angry with? So right off the bat, it seems clear that an atheist couldn't say this, but aside from that fact, just thinking about saying this statement would prove the problem of evil is false. You basically would be saying that God is not good, therefore there's no question about why there is evil in the first place. So this isn't something that an atheist would claim. Instead, an atheist would want to say that if God were to exist, then he would be evil because of the existence of evil in this world. And in fact, that's exactly what the problem of evil is claiming. The question then is, why think that God has to be 100% good? Is it reasonable to think that God might be at least partially evil? Well, one reason to think that it's not reasonable is this. If God exists, a being that creates all things other than himself from nothing, no pre-existent material, then he must be all-powerful and all-knowing. He must have existed from eternity since there was nothing to create him, so he must be all-sufficient because he lasted for an infinite amount of time, or before time existed if you prefer. But evil actions are the result of some kind of shortcoming, some kind of temptation or corruption, maybe some kind of intellectual shortcoming, something like that. But God, by hypothesis, wouldn't have any of these shortcomings. So God wouldn't do any evil because he just wouldn't have any reason to. I might be wrong about that objection, but seems pretty plausible to me. Another reason to think that this option isn't reasonable stems from the false dilemma response to the Euthyphro dilemma. In a recent video, we discussed reasons for thinking that if God exists, he would be the arbiter of all good or evil. For a brief recap, God invents all the things that he creates, so he kind of builds into them this way they should be. This is good for them to be a particular way, it's evil for them to be a particular way. But notice we can't say the same thing about God. There's no external thing creating him to be a particular way, so we can't say that he's good or evil based on whether he lives up to that standard or not. Remember, we're trying to get a response to the problem of evil, which is to say that it's not the case that if God exists, he would prevent all evil, because God wouldn't be all good. In other words, he'd be at least partially evil. But if we can't say that God is evil in any way, then we can't use this response to the problem of evil. Actually, this brings up a different problem. If we can't say that God is evil, then the question becomes, well, how can we say that God is good? And that lends itself to a slightly different possibility. In that Euthyphro dilemma video, we talked about the possibility that God would be good only in an analogical sense. What do I mean by analogical sense? We talked about vitamins being healthy versus my wife Mariah being healthy. When I say Mariah is healthy, it's because her body's working well. When I say vitamins are healthy, I don't mean that its body is working well. I mean that it causes health in my wife. In the same way, when we say God is good, we might be saying it analogically, not because we're comparing him to some standard of good gods, but because we're saying he sets the standard of goodness for all other things. How does this help? Now hear me out on this, because I think it might be a little distasteful initially when you hear what I'm about to say, but then I'll respond to some of the possible problems that you might have with it. The support for premise 2 is that God would not allow all evil because he's all good, but this argument rests on the idea that humans being good would not allow evil, at least if they could help it. But again, when we say God is all good, we're speaking analogically. We're not saying that he's good like a human is good. So there is no saying that God would do this or would do that because he's all good. Instead, God does what he does, and that just is good. So the support for premise 2 is false, and the problem of evil fails. Now, my guess is that you're not going to be satisfied with that answer, and for a couple of reasons. First, you may think, so God could do whatever he wanted and that would be good? What if he made some world that was incredibly abhorrent? Now, this is actually an idea that we also talked about in the Euthyphro dilemma, and there we pointed out that no, it wouldn't be so arbitrary because of God's nature. God's nature is such that he wouldn't create abhorrent things. Could he? With, he had enough power, sure, but he wouldn't desire those kinds of things because of the nature that he has. And God has always existed and his nature has never changed, so no, that kind of world would actually never be possible. A second reason you may not be satisfied is this. If God dictates what's good or evil for us, then surely he selects that in some way that's commensurate with his own nature, right? For example, God would choose love as a good thing because love would be in his nature. So although we won't be able to evaluate all of God's decisions the way that we would be able to evaluate human decisions, we should at least expect there to be some kind of similarity, right? So even though it could be the case that God could allow evil, surely we'd have to conclude that there must be some reason for him to do so that would be good in some way. And if that's what you're thinking, I actually agree with you. So coming up, we'll look at some possible reasons that God might have had for allowing evil, even though he is good. That's all I got for this time. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I'll see you next time. Adios.